I never thought I'd tell this to anyone. But 3 months ago, I was lying in my hospital bed after my own heart attack, scrolling through my phone at 4 in the morning, unable to sleep. That's when YouTube suggested a video that changed everything. Algerian imam had heart attack and saw Jesus in hospital. I almost scrolled past it. Almost. But something in that title grabbed me. An imam, like me, a heart attack. And Jesus, I clicked before I could stop myself. I listened to this man tell his story, how he flatlined on the operating table, how he met someone in a place between life and death, how he woke up speaking a name he'd been taught to fear. By the end, I was crying in that sterile hospital room, knowing that someone had walked the same impossible path I was about to walk. Your channel saved my life before I even knew my life needed saving. So here's my story. I heard a voice in the earth. They had already buried me. The sand was cold against my face, the white burial cloth tight around my body like a cocoon. But through the darkness, through the weight of soil above me, I heard someone speak with perfect clarity. Isa tells you, rise. The words cut through death itself, and I woke up. How did I end up in that shallow grave in the desert? They thought I was dead after the beating. My pulse had become so weak that even my cousins couldn't detect it. My breathing was so shallow, it looked like I'd stopped altogether. Following the old Bedouin traditions, they wrapped my body in white cloth and buried me in the sand, saying the prayers for the dead over what they believed was my corpse. But I wasn't dead. I was suspended somewhere between the world I knew and a realm I couldn't yet comprehend. The irony still haunts me. I died as a Muslim, or so they thought, but I woke up with Isa's name burning in my mind like a brand, like a signature written across my soul in letters of fire. The name I'd been taught to respect, but never to call upon. The name that would cost me everything I'd ever known and give me everything I'd ever needed. The voice that called me from the grave wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, gentle, patient, like someone who'd been waiting for me to listen for a very long time. Isa tells you, rise. Not a command, but an invitation. Not a demand, but an offer of something I'd been searching for without even knowing it. I rose as something else entirely. Someone hungry for truth, desperate for love, willing to lose everything to find the one who'd been calling my name all along. I was born into silk and marble, but I never knew freedom. The palace where I took my first breath had walls inlaid with gold calligraphy. Verses from the Quran written in elegant Arabic script that proclaimed the glory of submission, the beauty of surrender, the wisdom of never questioning what has been ordained. My father was the 3rd generation of imams in our family, and I was destined to be the 4th. This was not a choice. It was inheritance, like the color of my eyes or the shape of my hands. At 3 years old, while other children played with toys, I was learning to recite Al-Fatiha with perfect pronunciation. My father would sit me on his lap in his study, surrounded by ancient books and scrolls, and make me repeat each word until it rolled off my tongue like honey. Your voice belongs to Allah, he would say, his hand heavy on my small shoulder. One day, thousands will hear his truth through your lips. Even then, I felt the weight of expectation settling on me like a stone. The palace had 17 rooms, each more beautiful than the last. But I remember feeling trapped in every one of them. Servants moved through the corridors like shadows, their heads bowed, their voices never rising above a whisper when speaking to our family. They called me Young Master and Little Imam, titles that should have made me proud, but instead made me feel like I was wearing clothes that didn't fit. I was 5 years old and already being groomed to judge the souls of men I hadn't yet met. My days were structured with military precision: dawn prayers at 5:30, breakfast with religious instruction, morning Quran study, afternoon hadith memorization, evening theological discussion with my father's colleagues. By the time I was 7, I could recite 3 chapters of the Quran from memory and explain the 5 pillars of Islam to visiting dignitaries. But I had never thrown a ball, never built a fort out of cushions, never asked why the sky was blue without being told that such questions showed dangerous curiosity. My bedroom window overlooked a garden where our groundskeeper's son played every afternoon. I would watch him chase butterflies and dig holes in the dirt, his laughter carrying up to my window like music from another world. One day, I asked my mother if I could go outside and play with him. She looked at me with such sadness that I never asked again. "You are different," she said, touching my cheek. "You have a higher calling. Playing is for ordinary children." The weight of being extraordinary was crushing for a child. At 8, I was leading prayers for visitors who came to seek my father's blessing and guidance. I would stand on a small wooden platform so I could be seen above the prayer rugs, my voice echoing through the marble hall as I recited verses about paradise and punishment, love and judgment. The adults would nod approvingly, their faces glowing with religious fervor, and afterward they would tell my father how blessed he was to have such a devoted son. But I felt nothing during those prayers. The words passed through me like water through a sieve. Beautiful sounds with no meaning, ancient poetry that spoke of a God I couldn't feel. I began to wonder if something was wrong with me, if the spiritual numbness I experienced was a sign of some terrible flaw in my character. I tried to pray harder, to concentrate more deeply, to feel the presence of Allah that everyone else seemed to experience so easily. My tutor arrived when I turned 13, a man named Sheikh Hassan, whose reputation for creating perfect Islamic scholars was legendary throughout our region. He was tall and thin, with eyes like dark glass that seemed to see straight through to your soul. His method was simple: absolute submission to religious authority, complete memorization of Islamic texts, and the systematic destruction of any tendency toward independent thought. "Questions are the enemy of faith," he told me on our first day together. "A true believer accepts what Allah has revealed through His messenger. Doubt is Shaitan's whisper in your ear, trying to lead you away from the straight path." He carried a thin wooden rod that he used to strike my knuckles whenever I hesitated while reciting, whenever I asked why something was written a certain way, whenever I showed any sign of intellectual curiosity. The rod left small marks on my hands, but the real damage was to my spirit. Every question I suppressed, every doubt I buried, every moment of wonder I killed for the sake of religious correctness, these things accumulated like poison in my soul. I learned to speak with confidence about matters I didn't understand, to defend positions I had never been allowed to examine, to silence the small voice inside me that whispered, "But why? And what if?" And are you sure? By 15, I had memorized the entire Quran and could lead prayers for congregations of hundreds. Religious scholars from across the country would come to test my knowledge, and I never disappointed them. I could recite hadith collections for hours, explain complex theological concepts with ease, and debate fine points of Islamic jurisprudence with men 3 times my age. On the outside, I was everything they had hoped I would become. On the inside, I was dying. The palace that should have been my home felt like a prison. The knowledge that should have brought me closer to God felt like a wall between me and truth. The respect that should have filled me with pride felt like a weight that was slowly crushing my spirit. I was 17 years old and already felt like an old man, worn down by the burden of representing a faith I could recite but not feel, defend but not believe. I stood at my bedroom window one evening, watching the groundskeeper's son, now a young man, laughing with friends as they walked past our gates. They looked so free, so alive, so unaware of the heavy expectations that shaped every moment of my existence. I pressed my palm against the glass and wondered what it would feel like to be ordinary, to have questions without fear, to search for truth without being told I already possessed it. That was the night I first heard the voice. Not audibly, but as a whisper in my heart, so quiet I almost missed it. It said only one word, a name I had been taught to respect but never to seek: Isa. I dismissed it as exhaustion, as the stress of preparing for my upcoming public debut as the family's next generation imam. But the seed had been planted, and seeds, as I would learn, have a way of growing in the darkest soil. The first crack in my faith appeared when I was 18, during a study session with Sheikh Hassan. We were examining verses about unbelievers, and I made the mistake of asking why Allah, who was supposed to be merciful, commanded such harsh punishments for those who simply believed differently. The rod came down on my knuckles so hard that I saw stars. "Never ask such questions again," he hissed. "These thoughts come from Shaitan himself. Allah's wisdom is perfect, and questioning it is the first step toward apostasy." He made me copy verses about obedience for 3 hours straight. And it is not for a believing man or woman to have a choice when Allah and His Messenger have decided a matter. But the question wouldn't leave me alone. Late at night, I would wonder about the Christians and Jews in our city. Ordinary people buying bread, laughing with their children, showing kindness to strangers. Were these people really destined for eternal torment simply because they hadn't accepted Muhammad as the final prophet? My cousin Fatima was the only person I could share these doubts with, and only in whispers when we were sure no one could hear us. She was 3 years older, brilliant and curious, with a mind that refused to accept easy answers. During family gatherings, we would slip away to the library and share our questions in hushed voices. "Why can't women lead prayers?" she asked one afternoon, pointing to a troubling passage. "If Allah created all souls equal, why are we treated as spiritually inferior?" She showed me verses that seemed to contradict each other, passages about women that made my stomach turn, commands about warfare that felt incompatible with the merciful God I was supposed to love. "Look at this," she whispered, showing me a verse about taking captives, and this one about striking disobedient wives. How do we reconcile this with Allah is most merciful? I tried to explain these passages the way Sheikh Hassan had taught me, but the words felt hollow. Fatima listened patiently, then asked the question that would haunt me. If we have to explain away so much of what's written here, what does that say about the source? Our conversations ended abruptly one spring morning when Fatima wasn't at breakfast. My aunt's eyes were red from crying, and when I asked where Fatima was, she simply said, "Studying abroad." But I had heard my father and uncle talking in urgent voices the night before, using words like dangerous and influence and before it spreads. That afternoon, I found Fatima's room completely empty. Not just her belongings gone, but every trace of her existence scrubbed away. Her books were gone, her notes burned. Even the small indentations her pen had made on the desk had been sanded smooth. The message was clear. Ask too many questions, and you disappear. I never saw Fatima again. The fear changed me completely. Where I had once been curious, I became cautious. Where I had once asked why, I learned to nod and say, "Allah knows best." I perfected the art of giving correct answers while my real thoughts remained hidden, locked away in a part of my mind I tried never to visit. During Ramadan that year, I gave my first major public sermon to over 1,000 people. I stood behind the mihrab, looking out at a sea of bowed heads, and spoke about submission, obedience, and the dangers of questioning divine wisdom. My voice was strong, my delivery flawless, my theological arguments bulletproof. The congregation was moved to tears. My father beamed with pride, and visiting scholars praised my spiritual maturity. But inside, I felt like a fraud. Every word I spoke felt like a betrayal of the questions Fatima had awakened in me. I was becoming exactly what they wanted, a perfect vessel for transmitting beliefs I had never been allowed to examine, a mouthpiece for a God I was afraid to truly encounter. After the sermon, I remained alone in the mosque for a long time. The silence felt heavy, with all the words I couldn't say, all the doubts I couldn't voice. I knelt on the prayer rug and tried to feel something that might confirm the faith I was supposed to represent. But there was only emptiness, a hollow echo where passionate belief should have been. I recited verses about Allah's love and mercy, but they sounded like a foreign language in my own mouth. That night, walking through the palace gardens, I looked up at the stars and allowed myself one forbidden thought. What if we've got it all wrong? The question terrified me, but it also felt like the first honest moment I'd had in months. I was 19 years old, heir to a dynasty of religious authority, master of Islamic scholarship, and completely lost. The fear that had silenced my questions had also silenced my heart. I was surrounded by believers, but had never felt more alone. I was teaching others about God's love, but had never felt more afraid. The worst part was knowing this fear was exactly what they wanted. A questioning imam was dangerous, but a terrified one could be controlled. As long as I was more afraid of asking questions than living without answers, I would remain their perfect representative, hollow, obedient, and spiritually dead. At 21, the mosque that once smelled of cedar and melted wax felt less like a sanctuary and more like a theater. My throat could still shape every verse. My hands could still rise and fall in perfect cadence. yet each syllable skimmed the surface of me like rain on stone. Crowds traveled for hours to hear the prodigy Imam. I watched their eager faces and envied the certainty shining in their eyes. They heard revelation. I heard an echo. Night after night of Ramadan, I recited entire chapters by heart, the microphone feeding my voice into marble arches until it sounded larger than life. People wept. I felt nothing. During one Taraweeh, a pang of dizziness cut through the chant, and an uninvited thought flared. If I stopped speaking, would anyone notice I had no fire behind the words? I finished the rak'ah on autopilot, palms damp, heart rattling like a caged bird. Between prayers, I hid in the study lined with leather-bound commentaries. Opening those volumes used to thrill me, now the pages smelled of dust and duty. I reread a passage on the beauty of submission and realized I had submitted so completely that I could no longer locate myself inside the story. My scholarship was exquisite, my soul anemic. The crisis sharpened when a teenage student confided, "Sometimes I doubt Allah hears me." Textbook answers spilled from my tongue, tests strengthen faith, persevere in dhikr. But while he thanked me with tears, a single sentence pounded inside my skull. I don't know if he hears me either. The duplicity left a metallic taste in my mouth. Friday came. The main hall brimmed with 1,200 worshippers. My sermon topic, the greater jihad against the self. I spoke of slaying doubt, of strangling the ego, of immersing every desire beneath obedience. Halfway through, words deserted me. 30 full seconds of stunned silence stretched over the congregation. I felt their collective inhale, their confusion, my father's alarmed gaze. I forced the discourse to its end, cheeks blazing, certain the crack in my mask was visible to all. That evening, father approached in the jasmine courtyard. "Shaitan attacks those Allah favors," he comforted, mistaking emptiness for warfare. I nodded, unable to admit that the battlefield was vacant, that my enemy was absence itself. After he left, I stared at the fountain's dark water and realized the reflection looking back was a stranger expertly cosplaying devotion. Sleep offered no refuge. I dreamt of standing alone in an endless mosque, calling the adhan to rows of mannequins. My own voice ricocheted off stone and returned hollow, stretched, unrecognizable. Waking before dawn, I pressed my forehead to the prayer rug and whispered the Fatiha, hoping for a flicker of warmth. Only silence answered, thick and suffocating. I began to fear the call to prayer, not because I doubted God existed, but because, if he did, he appeared content to remain mute while I withered beneath his name. The paradox consumed me. I was celebrated as a guide, yet could not guide myself out of a fog that thickened with every public triumph. The dissonance reached a tipping point the night I sat alone beneath the minaret, legs dangling over the rooftop edge, star-strewn sky above, traffic hum below, and in the gulf between. I finally admitted the heresy my mind had circled for years. Perhaps memorizing a book is not the same as meeting its author. The moment the thought solidified, a tear slid down my cheek, my first honest act of worship in months. I was carrying a crate of commentaries back to the library when a sound I'd never heard inside our palace rooted me to the corridor. A woman softly singing. No ornate maqam, no rhythmic tajweed, Just a simple, lilting melody floating from the laundry room. The note curled through the air like incense, fragrant with something I could not name. Peering in, I saw Miriam, our gray-haired housekeeper, folding sheets in the pale afternoon light. Her lips shaped words I couldn't understand, yet every line vibrated with a tenderness my sermons lacked. When the floorboard creaked, she froze, eyes wide. "Forgive me, young master," she whispered, clutching the linen to her chest. "Old village song." "It's beautiful," I said, startled by the ache in my own voice. "Will you sing it again?" Fear flickered across her features. She glanced toward the hall, toward the ever-present ears of my father's staff, then shook her head. Better not. Silence swelled between us until, with tremulous resolve, she reached into her apron and pressed a folded scrap of paper into my palm. My grandmother told me to pass this to anyone hungry for hope. Then she turned back to the sheets, shoulders tight with risk. I retreated to my quarters and unfolded the note. 2 words, written in careful English letters, stared up at me. Isa. Hope. The name hit like desert wind, hot and disorienting. Isa, the prophet we honored yet kept at polite distance, the Jesus of the Christians whose scripture we dismissed as corrupted. My pulse hammered. That night, curiosity overpowered caution. Behind a VPN, I typed Jesus Hope into the search bar. Videos surfaced, testimonies, worship songs, explanations of a love that casts out fear. Each clip felt illicit, adrenaline mixing with yearning as I listened to strangers speak of forgiveness without earning, of a God who calls us children rather than servants. I expected intellectual arguments. Instead, I encountered stories. Broken addicts made whole, prisoners weeping with freedom no bars could contain, a former Algerian imam who met Jesus after a heart attack. His face glowed with the same quiet joy I'd glimpsed on Miriam. I kept the volume low, ear pressed to cheap headphones so the night guards wouldn't hear. Hours slipped by. Sometime before dawn, I opened an online Bible in secret. Matthew's words stared back. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Weariness, that I understood. Rest, I had never tasted. Tears blurred the screen. Before sunrise, I crept to the servants' wing. Miriam knelt by the washing basin. When she saw the dampness on my cheeks, understanding dawned in her eyes. No words passed between us, yet something sacred filled the space, an unspoken recognition that the gate of my iron world had been nudged ajar. All day, verses from both books tangled inside my head, the Quranic command to strive, the Nazarene invitation to rest, the threat of scales tipping against me, the promise of a yoke that is light. They clashed and chimed until evening, when Father summoned me for a surprise inspection of my study tablet. Terror surged, but I steadied my breath, thinking of Miriam's fragile scrap. "Hope," it declared. Hope. The examination would come, the reckoning would follow. But a seed had been sown in soil I once thought barren. And seeds, I was beginning to learn, do not concern themselves with the permission of those who guard the garden walls. Father's footsteps always announced themselves, slow, assured, echoing authority down the marble hall. That evening they stopped at my door without a knock. He entered, said nothing, and held out his hand for my tablet. My lungs froze. The screen was still warm from midnight searches, digital Bible, testimonies, worship songs hidden behind a VPN cloak. I passed it to him, praying the lock screen would buy me time, but he slid a finger across the glass. The last page I'd visited bloomed like a confession. "Come, all who are weary, and I will give you rest." For a heartbeat, we stood inside perfect stillness. Then, his gaze hardened into something colder than anger, betrayal carved in stone. "What is this?" he whispered, yet the room felt loud with accusation. The household elders assembled within the hour. They sat in a semicircle of velvet chairs while I knelt on the carpet like a defendant in a silent court. My tablet lay on a side table, that single verse still glowing, pulsing like forbidden light. One by one, they spoke of duty, lineage, legacy. Words sharpened into blades by disappointment. I was instructed to reaffirm the creed, denounce the foreign scripture, promise never again to wander from the path. Each demand waited for my obedient yes. My silence grew heavier than any answer. They imposed seclusion. 3 days in the storage wing, a small room windowed only by a lattice through which dust floated like restless spirits. They gave me a single book, the Quran I could already recite in my sleep, and a thin mat. The latch clicked. The hallway fell quiet. Time slowed to the thud of my heart. Daylight crept in slivers across the wall, marking hours I measured by the ache in my knees. I tried to read, but every verse linked itself to a question I'd buried. Hunger gnawed, thirst scratched, yet the sharper pain was inward. Had I imagined the peace I felt while reading Matthew? Had hope been a mirage? By the second night, the doubt turned into a desperate whisper. I pressed my forehead to the floor and breathed the only honest petition I possessed. "Isa, if you are real, speak louder than my fear." Sleep found me fitfully. I dreamt of standing at a crossroads carved into desert sand. One trail followed the familiar call of prayer. The other shimmered with an unknown horizon. I woke before choosing, palms slick with sweat, the air thick with incense from the evening lamps beyond the door. On the final morning, Father entered alone. No rod, no raised voice, only weary determination. He knelt so our eyes met. "You carry our people's honor," he said, voice ragged. "Do not dismantle it for fantasies." He lifted my chin, searching for the faithful son he had shaped. Finding a stranger, he sighed. "This is your last chance." A single sentence, but I heard the weight of generations pressing on my ribcage. I wanted to please him. I wanted the ache to stop. Yet when I opened my mouth, what emerged was not recantation, but the quietest refusal. "I cannot." Grief flickered across his face, quickly veiled by resolve. He rose, unlocked the door fully, and motioned to 2 cousins waiting outside. "Prepare him," he said, turning away. The word prepare hung in the air like a storm cloud. My fate had shifted from debate to discipline, and the palace that once felt like a prison now hinted at a darker cell beyond its gates. They led me to the unused guest suite, window shuttered, furniture draped in white cloth like sheeted ghosts. The cousins avoided my eyes, performing duty with the numb efficiency of men who obey orders to preserve their own futures. They left water, bandages, and a warning. "Speak the creed at dawn, or consequences follow." Night wrapped the room in thick velvet. Pain threaded through every breath. Each bruise throbbed with the rhythm of a drum. I curled on the floor, the mattress deliberately removed, and listened to the building settle. Pipes sighing, distant doors closing, servants whispering as if the walls themselves mourned. Sometime past midnight, exhaustion dragged me under. I found myself standing in a vast hall of polished stone, pillars stretching beyond sight. Scholars in black robes formed a circle around me, chanting verses I knew, but now twisted with condemnation. Their words became chains. My feet sank into the floor. Panic climbed my throat. Suddenly the chanting stopped. Silence pooled, deep and bright. A figure robed in luminous white stepped forward. His face was not blinding. It was familiar in a way I cannot explain, as though memory recognized what sight had never recorded. He reached toward me, and I flinched, expecting judgment. Instead, his fingertips brushed my torn sleeve. The fabric knitted whole, color returning. The chains dissolved into dust. He spoke no sentence, yet understanding flooded me. Shame is not my name, and fear is not my master. Light poured from him, filling the hall until the pillars disappeared, replaced by an endless field under a dawn sky. Wind carried the scent of almond blossoms. Impossible, because no orchard grows where I am from. I fell to my knees, not from force, but from release. Tears came, not of sorrow, but relief so fierce it felt like joy. He knelt beside me, placed a hand over my heart, and for an eternal second, every unanswered question quieted. I woke on the cold floor, the room still dark, yet a warm pulse thrummed beneath my ribs. Steady, courageous. My injuries ached, but something deeper had been sutured. Outside the shutters, the first call to prayer drifted through the city. I whispered into the fading dream, "I know who you are now." And though no audible reply came, sudden peace settled on my shoulders like a cloak. When the cousins returned at sunrise, expecting defeat, they found me standing, back straight, eyes clear. I greeted them softly. Confusion flickered, replaced by wary respect. They relayed a new decree. At dusk, I would be transported to a place of rehabilitation. The phrase carried edges, yet fear no longer commanded me. Love had claimed that throne in the night. The van arrived late afternoon, silver paint reflecting a sky bruised by approaching storm. Two relatives climbed out first, scanning the courtyard before beckoning me. Their expressions remained polite, but tension pulsed under every measured gesture. I was guided into the rear compartment. No restraints, only the unspoken certainty that resistance would find harsher hands. We drove beyond city walls, palm groves giving way to open plain. Dust clouds chased the tires, the horizon blurred in rising heat. I tried to pray, but words felt unnecessary. Instead, I recalled the Hall of Light, the quiet authority of the man in white. Each breath repeated his unspoken promise. "I am with you." An hour passed before the engine sputtered and stopped beside a decaying service station, abandoned, half swallowed by sand. One cousin stepped out to inspect a suspicious leak. The other stayed, thumb grazing his phone, forehead damp. I realized their instructions were unraveling. They had expected sedation, compliance, a quicker handoff deeper in the desert. Now uncertainty loomed. Opportunity often arrives disguised as breakdown. When the hood lifted and both men focused on hissing machinery, I slipped from the van's shadow into the glare. For a heartbeat, no one noticed. Then a shout cracked the air. I ran, sand gripping my sandals, heart-pounding harmony with the distant thunder. Adrenaline carved space between danger and me, but I knew speed alone wouldn't save me. The plane offered no cover. Ahead, a low ridge shimmered. I forced aching legs onward, lungs burning. A sudden honk, another vehicle cresting the road, headlights cutting the haze. Instinct overrode calculation. I veered toward it, waving both arms. The truck braked hard, gravel spraying. A middle-aged woman leaned from the window, eyes wide yet kind. Words tumbled out, half Arabic, half desperate plea. Perhaps she heard truth beneath the fragments. She opened the passenger door. I climbed in as the cousin's shouts grew louder behind. The truck accelerated. Wind whipped through the cracked glass, carrying the first drops of rain. A rare desert blessing. The woman introduced herself simply as Amal. "Peace," she said, as if presenting a gift. She offered a worn scarf for my bleeding brow. The fabric smelled of lavender. I thanked her, marveling that comfort could ride in such small gestures. Amal drove for hours, navigating back roads that bent like ribbons through barren land. At dusk, we reached a checkpoint marking the border with a neighboring territory, where my family's influence faded. Guards waved her through. Locals trusted her runs of produce and supplies. I kept my head low, pulse steady, the scarf hiding distinctive features. On the other side, night gathered quickly. Amal stopped by a modest clinic run by volunteers. "You're safe here," she said, pressing coins and a slip of paper with a pastor's name into my palm. "Tell him Amal sent you." I tried to express gratitude, but tears outran language. She rested a hand on my shoulder, eyes shining. "The one who called you will carry you." Then she was gone, taillights receding into desert dark. Inside the clinic, a nurse guided me to a cot. I sank onto the thin mattress, exhaustion folding over me like a blanket. Fluorescent lights hummed above, yet my thoughts drifted to stars hidden by the roof. Somewhere beyond, Father would learn I had vanished. Fury would follow, search parties, perhaps worse. But for the first time, distance stood between their plans and my future. I lay awake, tracing the journey. Palace scholar, secret doubter, silent prisoner, desert fugitive. None of those titles felt final. A new name hovered just beyond reach, a promise rather than a label, waiting to be spoken in water and dawn. I closed my eyes, listening for the voice that had shattered stone tombs and storage rooms alike. In the hush of that border clinic, it seemed to breathe with my own, steady and sure, as though whispering, "Keep walking." Resurrection is not a moment, but a path. The next morning, a transport driver offered passage to the nearest city in exchange for work-loading crates. I agreed, muscles still aching from the chase, hands trembling with residual adrenaline. The truck bed held boxes of dates and pottery. I wedged myself between them as we lurched onto the highway. Hours blurred past under a merciless sun. At rest stops, the driver bought me bread and water, asking no questions about my bruised face or nervous glances at approaching vehicles. Perhaps he had carried other fugitives. Perhaps kindness needed no explanation. When we reached the outskirts of town, he pressed a few bills into my palm. "May Allah protect your path," he said, unaware that another name had claimed that role. I wandered unfamiliar streets as evening fell. Neon signs flickered in languages I couldn't read. The air smelled of frying oil and diesel. My legs carried me without direction until exhaustion forced me to rest against a wall. Sleep came fitfully on the concrete, dreams mixing with the distant hum of traffic. Dawn brought a different sort of pursuit. 3 men in a sedan had been asking vendors about a young imam who might be hiding nearby. I recognized the description, the urgency in their questions. Father's reach extended farther than I'd hoped. When one of them glanced my way, I slipped into an alley, heart hammering against my ribs. They found me an hour later. I was buying fruit from a corner stand when a hand clamped down on my shoulder. "Time to come home," a familiar voice said. My uncle, Father's youngest brother, the one who'd always shown me small kindnesses during childhood. His eyes held regret, but also resolve. Behind him stood 2 men I didn't recognize, their presence eliminating any thought of escape. The van they used was unmarked, windows tinted. I was placed in the back seat between the strangers, while my uncle took the front. As we drove away from the city, he turned to face me. "This ends when you remember who you are," he said softly. "Your family, your faith, your duty, they haven't changed." But I had changed, irrevocably, and no amount of distance could undo the transformation. We drove for hours into emptiness. No landmarks, no traffic, only endless sand under a bleaching sky. When the van finally stopped, we were nowhere. One of the men checked my pulse at the wrist, counting beats with professional dispassion. The heat was overwhelming. My consciousness wavered like a mirage. Voices grew distant. Someone mentioned tradition, proper burial, desert custom. Darkness claimed me before I could protest. I woke to suffocation. White cloth covered my face, dirt pressed against my limbs, weight bearing down from above. Panic flared. I was underground, wrapped like the dead, breathing my own exhaled air. Had they actually? My fingers clawed at the fabric, tearing it away from my mouth. The burial was shallow. Perhaps they'd been interrupted. Or perhaps this was meant as warning rather than execution. But as I struggled against the sand, something impossible happened. Through the earth above, through layers of soil and stone, came a voice I recognized from the Hall of Light. "Isa tells you, rise." Not heard with ears, but felt in the marrow of bones, the echo of chambers beyond the heart. Power flowed into limbs that should have been lifeless. I dug upward with strength I didn't possess, gasping and choking as handfuls of desert fell away. When I broke the surface, the night sky seemed vast enough to hold every prayer ever offered. Stars blazed overhead, while silence wrapped the dunes like a held breath. I was alone in a landscape that stretched to every horizon, yet loneliness had fled. The voice that called me from the grave walked beside me now, invisible but undeniable. I stood on shaking legs, spitting sand, tearing away the burial cloth that had become my chrysalis. The transformation was complete. No longer the imam's dutiful son, no longer the scholar trapped in tradition's cage. I was someone new, someone called by name from death into a life I couldn't yet imagine, but already trusted. The small church sat at the edge of town like a lighthouse on a forgotten shore. A single bulb burned above the wooden door, casting a circle of warm light into the desert night. I stumbled toward it on feet that had carried me across miles of sand, following the voice that had become my compass, the name that had become my song. The pastor who answered my knock was a man in his 60s, with kind eyes and weathered hands. He took one look at my torn burial clothes, my sand-crusted hair, my bleeding feet, and simply stepped aside. "Come in, brother," he said in accented Arabic, as if resurrection survivors appeared on his doorstep regularly. The sanctuary was small, but filled with something I had never encountered in the grand mosque of my youth: presence. Not the echoing emptiness of religious performance, but the gentle density of love made tangible. Wooden pews worn smooth by countless prayers, a simple cross-catching lamplight, hymn books with covers soft from handling. Everything spoke of encounters, of hearts that had found what mine was still seeking. I collapsed in the back pew, too exhausted for pretense. The pastor brought water and a blanket, then sat quietly beside me while I drank and tried to make sense of words in a language I barely knew. Eventually, he opened a book, not the ornate Quran of my upbringing, but something smaller, more intimate. "Isaiah," he said softly, then began to read. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you walk through fire, you will not be burned." The words fell on my soul like rain on cracked earth. For the first time in my life, Scripture felt personal, not a set of rules to be obeyed, but a conversation to be joined. The pastor continued, "Because you are precious in my sight and honored, and I love you." Love, not earned through performance, not conditional on perfection, but given freely to the exile, the refugee, the one who had lost everything and found himself. I tried to explain my journey in broken Arabic mixed with English phrases. The pastor listened without judgment as I told him about the dream, the voice in the grave, the impossible strength that had lifted me from sand to starlight. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said simply, "He has been calling you for a long time. Tonight you finally heard clearly enough to follow." We prayed together, not the rigid formality of Islamic ritual, but conversation with someone who felt closer than breath. Words poured out of me that I didn't know I knew. Gratitude and wonder and desperation all mingled together. For the first time in my 28 years, prayer felt like coming home, rather than fulfilling an obligation. As dawn touched the windows, painting everything in soft gold, I knelt on the worn carpet and spoke the words that had been building in my chest for months. "Jesus, I don't want to live without you." The sentence was simple, but it split my life in two: before and after, death and resurrection, fear and love. What happened next defied description. Warmth flooded my chest, spreading to every extremity until I felt lit from within. Years of suppressed tears broke free, but these were not tears of grief. They were tears of recognition, of homecoming, of a son finally embraced by the father he had been seeking without knowing it. The empty space where faith should have lived suddenly overflowed with presence so real, I could have reached out and touched it. I wept until no tears remained, then sat in stillness that buzzed with life. The pastor's hand rested gently on my shoulder. The silence held us both like cupped palms. Outside, the muezzin's call drifted across the awakening city, but for the first time that sound held no command over me. I had found my true call in a voice that spoke love rather than law, invitation rather than demand. When I finally stood, my legs felt different. Not just steadier, but pointed toward a new horizon. The burial clothes I had worn into that sanctuary would stay behind, symbols of a death that was now complete. Whatever came next would require new garments, a new name, a new understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. The pastor smiled and handed me fresh clothes. "Welcome to the family," he said, and I understood that this was not metaphor. I had been adopted into something larger than blood, older than tradition, more enduring than the empire I had fled. As I changed clothes in the small room behind the altar, I could hear him preparing breakfast, humming the same sort of melody that had first called me through Miriam's voice. Simple, peaceful, shot through with joy. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, not the polished imam or the desperate fugitive, but someone new, someone loved, someone free, someone whose real story was just beginning. 6 months have passed since that dawn in the small church. 6 months since I spoke the words that changed everything. The man who emerged from those borrowed clothes was not the same person who had crawled from a desert grave. I chose the name Elias, the prophet who experienced God's presence not in earthquake or fire, but in a gentle whisper. Like him, I had been through the storm and found peace in the quiet voice that calls us beyond fear. The border town where I now live is nothing like the marble palace of my childhood. My apartment has 2 rooms and a window that overlooks a busy street where children play soccer between the parked cars. The sounds that once would have distracted me from prayer, car horns, laughter, dogs barking, have become the soundtrack of grace. God is not offended by the noise of life. He joins it. I work with an organization that helps others who have walked similar paths. Former Muslims, refugees of conscience, people who have lost everything to gain their souls. We meet in a community center every Tuesday night, sharing stories over coffee and simple meals. There are no titles here, no hierarchies, just broken people learning to be whole and whole people admitting they are broken. Last week, a young woman from Afghanistan sat in the circle for the first time. Her hands shook as she spoke about dreams where someone kept calling her name, about questions that wouldn't stay buried, about family who would rather mourn a dead daughter than celebrate a living Christian. I saw myself in her terror and wonder, remembered the night I first heard Isa whisper through Miriam's song. I told her what the pastor told me. He has been calling you for a long time. Tonight, you finally heard clearly enough to follow. Then we prayed together in English and Farsi, and the universal language of tears. And I watched light dawn in her eyes, the way it had dawned in mine 6 months earlier. This is what freedom looks like. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of love, strong enough to make any struggle worthwhile. I carry scars from the cousin's beating, memories that wake me at night in cold sweats, an ache for family members I may never see again. But I also carry something I never possessed in the palace. Peace that doesn't depend on performance, worth that isn't earned through religious achievement, a future built on grace rather than fear. Sometimes I record videos for people still trapped in the golden cages of religious duty. I speak directly into the camera, looking for the face behind the screen who might be hearing their true name called for the first time. You are not alone, I tell them. The voice that seems so foreign, so dangerous, so impossible, that voice knows you better than you know yourself. I am no longer a prince in a palace of fear. I am a son in my Father's house of love. The title I lost, Imam, scholar, heir to a dynasty, seems small now compared to the name I have gained, beloved. It is written not in calligraphy on marble walls, but in scars on nail-pierced hands. It is spoken not in the language of law, but in the dialect of grace. The grave they dug for me in the desert was meant to be my end. Instead, it became my beginning. I didn't rise from the dead like Lazarus. My body never stopped breathing, but I rose from the death of living without love, without hope, without the voice that makes every burden light and every yoke easy. If you are watching this, if you have heard that same quiet voice calling your name in the darkness, if you have felt the stirring of questions that your tradition cannot answer, know this: you are not crazy. You are not alone. You are not beyond hope. The voice that called me from the grave is calling you from wherever you are buried. Trust it. Follow it. Let it raise you into the light. The one who spoke my name in the earth is speaking yours right now. Listen, he is calling you to rise.